My beloved child, wait just a little longer before your thoughts rush ahead, because something quiet has already begun to unfold, and if you move too quickly, you may miss the very moment that gives everything its meaning. There are conversations that disappear into the air the instant they end, and then there are conversations that continue to echo long after the final word has been spoken. This was one of those conversations. The person you love found themselves in a place where they could no longer keep every feeling locked inside. They carried your name with unusual care, almost as though speaking it too loudly might change something delicate that had only just begun to bloom. They hesitated. They smiled without realizing it. They looked away for a moment, searching for the right words, because some emotions refused to fit into ordinary sentences. What happened next was far more meaningful than anyone in that moment expected. Don't skip, because the smallest detail is often the one that quietly changes everything. The one sitting across from them noticed the silence before the words. They didn't interrupt. They simply waited. Sometimes, waiting tells us more than speaking ever could. Your person took a slow breath, almost as if gathering scattered pieces of their heart together, and then your story entered the room. Not as a dramatic announcement, but as something gentle, honest, and deeply personal. They didn't describe you the way most people describe someone they know. Instead, they spoke about the way your presence lingered in their thoughts after ordinary days. They spoke about moments that seemed insignificant to everyone else but somehow remained unforgettable to them. They admitted that even when life became busy, your memory refused to fade into the background. There was no rush in their voice. Only sincerity. Only quiet reflection. Only a growing realization that what they felt had become impossible to ignore. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Silence has a language of its own, and this silence carried understanding instead of uncertainty. Then the other person leaned forward ever so slightly and asked a question that no one had expected. It wasn't about where you lived. It wasn't about what you looked like. It wasn't even about whether you would meet again. It was a question that reached much deeper. How do you feel whenever you think about them? Those words settled into the air with remarkable gentleness, and suddenly your person found themselves answering without rehearsing anything. They confessed that thinking of you brought an unusual calm, even on difficult days. They admitted that some people enter your life loudly, while others quietly become part of your future without asking for permission. As those words escaped, even they seemed surprised by their own honesty. Something important is waiting for you, because the conversation did not stop there. The listener smiled, not because they knew the ending, but because they recognized something familiar. They had seen many people talk about admiration before. They had heard excitement, attraction, curiosity, even temporary fascination. But this sounded different. This carried patience instead of urgency. It carried respect instead of impulse. It carried hope without demanding certainty. And then they said something so unexpected that your person became completely still. Those few words were not dramatic. They were not loud. Yet they reached places inside the heart that loud words never could. Your person didn't answer immediately. Instead, they looked down, almost as though they were seeing their own feelings more clearly for the first time. What they heard next caused every memory about you to arrange itself differently inside their mind. Moments they had once dismissed suddenly seemed meaningful. Tiny conversations became unforgettable. Ordinary smiles felt extraordinary. Even the smallest kindness you had shown appeared brighter than before. It was as if someone had quietly opened a window in a room they didn't realize had been dark. No miracle happened. No impossible event occurred. Only understanding. Sometimes understanding changes everything more gently than excitement ever could. Stay till the end, because this is only where the first layer begins to reveal itself. The conversation was no longer about what your person thought of you. It had become something much deeper. It had become about what they were beginning to understand about themselves whenever your name appeared in their heart. And just when they believed the most meaningful words had already been spoken. The other person leaned in one final time, lowered their voice, and shared an observation so unexpected, that your person could do nothing except quietly whisper, "I never looked at it that way before." And that single realization would become the beginning of everything revealed in the next word. The words that followed did not arrive with urgency. They arrived with remarkable calm, the kind of calm that quietly reshapes a person's understanding without them even noticing at first. The one listening looked into your person's eyes and said, "Have you noticed that every time you speak about them, you stop trying to impress anyone?" The room fell silent again. Your person searched for an answer but found only reflection. They replayed every conversation, every memory, every unexpected smile, and little by little they realized something they had never intended to admit. Around your memory, they never felt the need to become someone else. They could simply be themselves. That realization lingered far longer than either of them expected. Don't skip, because sometimes the quietest discoveries become the ones that stay with us forever. A gentle smile crossed their face, not because every question had been answered, but because one important question no longer needed an answer. They remembered moments they had almost forgotten. Small exchanges. Ordinary conversations. Tiny acts of kindness that seemed almost invisible at the time. Yet together they formed something surprisingly meaningful. Looking back, they realized none of those moments had been accidental in the way they once believed. Each one had quietly revealed another piece of the picture, but only now were they able to see the image as a whole. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It was simply real, and sometimes reality carries more beauty than imagination ever could. The conversation drifted toward the future without either of them intending it to. The listener asked softly, "If you met them today, what would be different?" Your person didn't answer immediately. Instead, they let the question settle into their heart. They imagined standing before you once again, but this time without overthinking every word or hiding behind uncertainty. They imagined choosing honesty over hesitation, kindness over confusion, presence over distance. It wasn't about changing the past. It was about understanding what truly mattered if another meaningful moment ever arrived. Something important is waiting for you, because the listener noticed another detail your person hadn't recognized. Every time you talk about them, they said, your voice becomes quieter, but somehow stronger. Your person blinked in surprise. They had never noticed that. Yet the more they reflected, the more it felt true. Some people make us speak louder. Others make us speak more honestly. You belong to the second kind. That realization carried a quiet warmth that words could barely explain. For a long while, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. They simply allowed the conversation to breathe. Outside, the world continued exactly as it always had, unaware that something meaningful was unfolding inside that simple exchange. It was never about grand declarations. It was about recognizing the value of someone whose presence continued to leave gentle traces long after they were gone. Your person began to understand that the memories they carried were not fading with time. If anything, they were becoming clearer. Stay till the end, because the conversation was approaching a moment neither of them could have predicted. The listener slowly reached into a nearby notebook and turned to a page containing a single handwritten sentence. They slid it across the table without saying a word. Your person looked down and read it once. Then again. Their expression changed completely. They didn't laugh. They didn't cry. They simply became very still, as though one ordinary sentence had somehow explained months of unanswered thoughts. They folded the page carefully and whispered, almost to themselves, "That is exactly what I've been trying to understand." But the sentence itself was not revealed, not yet. The meaning behind those handwritten words would become the turning point of everything that follows, and once your person finally shared what they had read, nothing about the conversation would feel quite the same again. The folded page remained in your person's hands long after the conversation should have moved on. They didn't rush to speak. They traced the edge of the paper with their fingertips, almost as though unfolding it too quickly might cause its meaning to disappear. The one across from them waited patiently, understanding that some truths need silence before they can become words. Then, with a quiet breath, your person looked up and said, "I thought I was trying to understand them, but maybe I've been discovering something about myself all along." In that simple confession, the atmosphere shifted. It no longer felt like two people discussing someone they cared about. It felt like someone finally recognizing a part of their own heart that had been gently waiting to be noticed. Don't skip, because what came next revealed even more than anyone expected. The listener smiled with quiet understanding and asked another question that seemed almost too simple. When was the first moment you realized they stayed in your thoughts? Your person searched through countless memories. They expected to find one dramatic turning point, one unforgettable event that explained everything. Instead, they found something entirely different. It wasn't a grand moment at all. It was a collection of ordinary seconds. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A smile remembered hours later. A kind word that continued echoing after the day had ended. Piece by piece, those small moments had quietly built something lasting without asking for attention. Your person laughed softly, almost surprised by their own realization. "I kept waiting for a huge sign," they admitted, "but maybe the biggest signs were the quiet ones I almost overlooked." The listener nodded. "The moments that stay with us the longest are rarely the loudest," they replied. "They're the ones that gently return when life becomes still." Those words settled deeply. Suddenly, memories that once seemed ordinary carried new meaning. The pauses mattered. The little details mattered. Even the moments that felt incomplete now seemed like chapters of a story that had been unfolding much longer than anyone realized. Something important is waiting for you, because your name entered the conversation once again, but this time in a completely unexpected way. The listener asked, if they could hear only one honest sentence from you today, what would it be? Your person didn't prepare an answer. They didn't search for perfect words. They simply spoke from the quiet place inside their heart where sincerity lives. "I would tell them they changed the way I noticed the world," they whispered. Not because they tried to, but because after meeting them, ordinary days didn't feel quite so ordinary anymore. Even after saying it aloud, they sat in thoughtful silence, as though hearing the truth for the very first time themselves. The conversation drifted gently toward hope. Not the kind built on certainty, but the kind that grows from appreciation. Your person realized they had spent so much time wondering what might happen next that they had almost forgotten to value what had already happened. Every meaningful exchange. Every shared smile. Every unexpected memory had quietly shaped who they were becoming. There was peace in that realization. No rushing. No pressure. Only gratitude for something genuine. Then the listener leaned back, looked thoughtfully toward the window, and spoke with remarkable calm. There's one more thing you haven't noticed. Your person looked up immediately. Whenever you speak about them, the listener continued, you never describe what they have. You describe how they make people feel. The words landed with extraordinary gentleness. Your person became completely still. They had never recognized that pattern before. Yet it was true. They remembered your kindness before your appearance. Your warmth before your accomplishments. Your presence before anything else. And somehow, that realization explained more than they could have imagined. Stay till the end, because the conversation was nearing its quiet turning point. Your person carefully unfolded the page one final time and looked at the sentence again. This time, they didn't keep it to themselves. They looked across the table with new understanding and softly said, "Now I finally know why those words felt so familiar." The listener smiled knowingly and replied, "Then you're ready to hear the one thing I've been waiting to tell you from the beginning." Your person's heartbeat seemed to pause, not from fear, but from anticipation, because whatever those next words were, they carried the quiet promise of changing the entire meaning of the conversation. And that moment would unfold in the next part. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The silence no longer felt empty, it felt full of possibilities waiting to be understood. Your person watched the expression on the listener's face, sensing that the next few words had been carefully held back until exactly the right moment. Then, almost in a whisper, the listener spoke. "You've spent so much time wondering whether they truly matter to you, but you've never stopped to ask whether they quietly changed the person you've become." Those words settled gently, like the final piece of a puzzle finding its place without force. Don't skip. Because this realization reached further than either of them expected. Your person closed their eyes for just a second. Memories began returning, not in perfect order, but as scattered moments connected by a feeling they could no longer ignore. They remembered becoming more patient without noticing when it began. They remembered smiling at small things that once passed unnoticed. They remembered catching themselves hoping the best for someone else before thinking about themselves. None of these changes had happened overnight. They had arrived quietly, one ordinary day at a time, until they became part of who they were. And somehow, every path seemed to lead back to you. The listener gently asked, "Do you know why that matters?" Your person slowly shook their head. "Because real connections don't always announce themselves," came the reply. "Sometimes they reveal themselves through the person you become while carrying someone in your heart." The room grew still once again. Those words didn't feel like advice. They felt like recognition. Your person wasn't simply remembering you anymore. They were beginning to understand the quiet influence your presence had left behind. Something important is waiting for you, because the conversation turned toward a memory your person had never shared with anyone. It wasn't a dramatic story. It wasn't a life-changing event. It was a simple afternoon when they almost reached out to you, only to pause and wonder whether the moment was right. At the time, they believed that hesitation meant uncertainty. Now, sitting in that quiet conversation, they realized it had meant something entirely different. They had cared enough to choose their words carefully. They had valued the connection enough not to rush it. Suddenly, what once looked like hesitation appeared as quiet respect. The listener noticed the change immediately. "You're smiling," they said softly. Your person seemed surprised. They hadn't realized it themselves. It wasn't the smile of someone who had found every answer. It was the smile of someone who had stopped asking the wrong questions. There was peace in that moment, the kind that doesn't arrive because everything is certain, but because the heart no longer needs to pretend it feels nothing. Outside, the day continued as usual. People walked past without knowing that inside that small conversation, something deeply meaningful had unfolded. Your person looked out the window and quietly admitted, "I think I've been waiting for someone to explain what I already knew deep inside." The listener nodded with quiet understanding. "Sometimes," they replied, "we don't need new feelings. We only need the courage to recognize the ones that have been there all along. Stay till the end." Because just when it seemed the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, the listener reached into a jacket pocket and carefully placed a small folded note on the table. "I almost forgot," they said with a gentle smile. "Before we met today, someone asked me to remember these words." Your person's eyes widened with quiet curiosity. They slowly unfolded the note, expecting only a sentence. Instead, they found something that instantly brought complete stillness to the room. They read the first line once, then a second time, and whispered with unmistakable sincerity, "So, this is what they wanted someone to understand about them." The listener didn't interrupt. They simply watched as your person continued reading, each new line revealing another piece of a message that had never been meant for the crowd, only for a heart willing to receive it. And the final words written on that note would become the most unforgettable part of the entire conversation. Waiting quietly to be revealed in the next words. The note rested lightly between your person's hands, yet it felt as though it carried the weight of every unanswered thought they had been quietly holding on to. They didn't rush to the final line. Instead, they read each sentence slowly, allowing every word to settle before moving to the next. The room was so still that even the smallest pause seemed meaningful. Then, almost without realizing it, your person smiled. A calm, genuine smile that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with understanding. Don't skip, because what they discovered was not a secret about the future. It was a truth about the present that had been waiting patiently to be seen. The first sentence on the page was beautifully simple: "Some people leave an impression because of what they say. Others leave one because of how they make you feel." Your person read it again, this time with their eyes closed. Faces from the past came and went in their memory, but one presence remained steady. Yours. Not because every moment had been extraordinary, but because even the ordinary moments had quietly carried warmth, sincerity, and peace. They finally understood why your memory had never needed to compete for attention. It had never been loud. It had simply been real. The listener watched with quiet patience before asking, "Does that sentence remind you of anyone?" Your person looked up without hesitation. There was no dramatic pause this time. No uncertainty. Only quiet honesty. "Yes," they answered softly. "It reminds me of the person I've been talking about this entire time." The words felt lighter than expected, almost as though speaking them aloud had lifted something they didn't know they had been carrying. Something important is waiting for you, because beneath that first sentence was another line, written in careful handwriting. The people who change us most rarely ask for recognition. They simply live with kindness, and that kindness continues long after the moment has passed. Your person's eyes remained fixed on those words. Suddenly, dozens of forgotten memories returned, not because they were spectacular, but because they had been quietly meaningful. A thoughtful conversation. A patient response. A moment of encouragement that arrived exactly when it was needed. Tiny pieces of life that had become impossible to forget. For the first time during the conversation, your person laughed softly. "I kept searching for one unforgettable moment," they admitted, when in reality it was hundreds of small moments quietly working together. The listener smiled knowingly. "That's often how the strongest stories begin," they replied. "Not with one loud chapter, but with many gentle ones." A comfortable silence filled the room once again. It no longer felt like they were searching for answers. It felt as though the answers had been beside them all along, simply waiting for enough stillness to be noticed. Your person carefully folded the note again, not to hide it, but to preserve it. Some words deserve to be carried rather than displayed. "Stay till the end," because just as they prepared to leave, the listener spoke one final sentence that stopped your person in their tracks. "There's one part of this conversation I haven't told you yet," they said quietly. "Before we met today, I asked myself one question: if I could describe the connection you've been talking about in a single sentence, what would it be?" Your person turned back, their curiosity stronger than ever. The listener looked directly at them and gently said, "I think you've mistaken familiarity for coincidence, when perhaps it has always been appreciation quietly growing over time." Your person didn't answer immediately. They simply stood there, letting those words echo in their heart. And then, almost in a whisper, they replied, "If that's true, then there's one thing I still need to say." What those words were, why they had remained unspoken for so long, and how they would completely reshape the meaning of everything that had been shared, would finally be revealed in the next. A quiet breeze slipped through the open window just as your person drew one slow, steady breath. It was almost as if the world itself had chosen to become still, making room for words that had waited far longer than anyone realized. They didn't begin speaking immediately. Instead, they looked down at the folded note once more, gently pressing it between their hands before lifting their eyes with a calm they hadn't carried at the beginning of the conversation. What they were about to say wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't perfect. It was simply true. Don't skip, because sometimes the simplest truths are the ones that stay with us the longest. "I've been trying to explain what makes them different," your person said quietly, "but every explanation feels too small." The listener didn't interrupt. They simply nodded, inviting the thought to continue. "It isn't one conversation," your person went on. "It isn't one memory. It isn't even one feeling. It's the quiet way they remain with me long after the moment has passed. Somehow, ordinary days remind me of them without asking for permission. As those words settled into the silence, your person realized they were no longer searching for the right description. They had already found it. The listener smiled warmly. Then perhaps you've answered every question you came here with. Your person paused and gently shook their head. Not every question, they replied. There's still one. The room became still once again. Why does this connection continue to feel unfinished? It wasn't a question filled with doubt. It was filled with wonder. The kind of wonder that appears when something meaningful refuses to disappear from the heart. Something important is waiting for you, because the answer came in the gentlest way imaginable. Maybe, the listener said softly, not every meaningful story asks to be rushed toward an ending. Some stories quietly invite us to appreciate what they have already given us while allowing the next chapter to arrive in its own time. Those words didn't promise anything extraordinary. They didn't predict tomorrow. They simply offered peace to the present moment. And strangely, that peace felt more valuable than certainty ever could. Your person looked out through the window once more. The world outside appeared exactly the same as before. The trees still moved gently in the breeze. People continued walking without knowing that inside this quiet room, an entirely different journey had taken place. Yet everything felt different now, not because the world had changed, but because understanding had quietly replaced uncertainty. Then something unexpected happened. Your person reached into their pocket and carefully unfolded a small piece of paper they had carried for weeks. The listener looked at it with curiosity. "You've been carrying that all this time?" they asked. Your person nodded with a gentle smile. "I wrote these words a long time ago," they admitted, "but I never knew whether they truly reflected what I felt." Slowly, they unfolded the page and read it aloud. It says, "Some people become unforgettable not because they ask for attention, but because their kindness quietly becomes part of your everyday thoughts. They remind you that life feels a little brighter simply because they exist." The room fell completely silent. The listener's expression softened. "You wrote that before today's conversation?" they asked. Your person smiled. "Yes." "Then today's conversation didn't create your feelings," the listener replied. "It simply helped you recognize what had already been living inside your heart." For the first time all day, your person wasn't trying to solve anything. They weren't trying to define every emotion or predict every tomorrow. They simply allowed themselves to appreciate the quiet beauty of what they had discovered. Some connections don't become meaningful because of one unforgettable event. They become meaningful because, little by little, they teach us to notice kindness, patience, hope, and gratitude in ways we never expected. Stay till the end, because as your person prepared to leave, the listener offered one final thought that lingered long after the conversation ended. "If you ever meet them again," they said gently, "don't try to impress them with perfect words. Simply let them see the person you've become." Your person smiled with quiet confidence, folded the note one last time, and stepped outside. The conversation was over, but its meaning had only just begun to unfold. Sometimes the greatest message isn't hidden in a dramatic confession. Sometimes it lives in the quiet realization that the people who truly matter help us become a little more patient, a little more grateful, and a little more ourselves. And somewhere beyond that ordinary day, carrying nothing more than a peaceful heart and a clearer understanding, your person walked forward, knowing that some conversations end with silence, but the most meaningful ones continue echoing long after the final word has been spoken.